Good evening, everybody. You're here for the meeting, the public meeting about the Unified Development Code. You're in the right place, so it's good to see you all. I'm Community Development Director in Cobb County. I've been here for about 3.5 years now, but Cobb County is home for me. Born and raised, I have, got my Kennesaw State Owls lanyard here because I'm a KSU grad, proud to Keatron High School grad. So this is home, still is, always has been, hopefully always will be. And this project is very important to me, both in my role as community development director, but also as someone who loves Cobb County and always has, and proud to be prepared. This evening, we're going to be doing, this is the kickoff meeting for the Unified Development Code. And I know some of you have heard me talking about that over the last year or so, and our hopes that we could start this project. As I know, a lot of you know, who are kind of involved in zoning and development projects and familiar with it, our codes and regulations for development are spread out over several documents. It's several hundred pages of codes and regulations that pertain to zoning and development. And some of those date back to the 70s. Over the years, they've been piecemealed and patched up and stitched together a little bit, added to. But at this point, we're at a point where we want to take those regulations that we have, bring them into a consolidated document, help to streamline it, make the processes a little bit easier, make the document easier for you all as citizens to understand, make it easier for people who are looking to build and develop in Cobb County and do business in Cobb County to understand, and also to help our staff do a great job of implementing those plans that have been put in place for the county. So we have engaged a company called Clarion Associates to lead us through this process. And this evening, we're going to let them do a presentation. Again, this is the kickoff meeting. So this is the first meeting. There will be several more along the way. The project is going to be about 18 to 20 months. So I hope that you guys are going to be along for the ride with us for a while. But this is the first meeting where really we just want to introduce everybody to the project. Here's some initial thoughts on kind of what you think some of our priorities should be, some of the things that we should look at as we move forward. And just know that this is something that is going to be a collaborative effort with all of you, with our commissioners, with our staff, and with our business community. So it's important that everybody's at the table and everybody has a voice. So thank you for being here. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Craig Richardson of Clarion.
Great, thank you, Jessica. Good evening, I should say, everyone. Thank you. And I see some familiar faces for those of you who have either attended some of the focus group meetings or at the public forum we had last night. You'll hear some things you heard in your meetings, but we're really delighted to have you here. In terms of where we're going to go with the presentation, I'm going to just take a few minutes and introduce our team. Jessica mentioned our firm, Clarion Associates, but we are also joined and delighted to have on our team two other professional service firms, the collaborative firm and Stantec. And I just want to give you a little background on our experience and introduce some of the team members. After we do that, I think it's important that I cover with you. Jessica talked about this being an 18 to 20 month process, so it's going to go over a couple of years, is to let you know what that process is, when there are going to be some key times when we are going to have follow-up meetings. In other words, we're not going to have this meeting, get your comments, go back and start drafting the code document. We're going to have multiple opportunities and increments in this process as we go along. So it's important to you to understand that. And then we have had meetings with two focus groups of representatives from civic organizations and a focus group of representatives from business groups. We have met with staff. We have met with some of your elected officials. We have put a survey questionnaire online for people to fill out. We've already gotten a lot of input, and one of the things that myself and my colleague Jeff Green with our firm will do is sort of highlight for you what we have already heard and give you some ideas, at least of some of the comments we've gotten about what some of the project goals or objectives for the effort should be. This is not etched in stone right now. We are taking your comments. We took comments last night about what folks in the community thought were important. So we want to hear from you. After that is we actually have a survey that we are going to ask you to participate in and provide us some answers to some general questions that we have about this project. And after you've done that collectively as a group, we'll be able to show you the results of the survey as you take it. We're going to throw the floor open, the platform open to you to have you ask any questions or to provide us any comments about what goals you think would be important for us to achieve in this update process of the Unified Development Code. So that's where we're going. In terms of Clarion Associates, we are a mid-sized planning consulting firm. We have about 20 professionals. We have 2 offices. One of them is in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, in the Research Triangle area. The other office is in Denver, Colorado. We are a firm of city planners, attorneys, urban designers, architects, graphic designers. We have many of our firm professionals actually have expertise in a couple of those areas. One of the focuses of our practice is working with local governments in comprehensively updating development codes like this project. Firm was started in 1992, and since then we have successfully completed, in other words, had adopted over 150 codes across the country. In our Chapel Hill office, we do an extensive amount of work in the Southeast and the East Coast. We also work in the Midwest, and we have projects going on in the West too. Our Denver office primarily focuses in the Rocky Mountain states and the Midwest and their work. Some of the projects, just to give you I'm not going to list them all, some of the development code projects that we have successfully completed or are working on right now include the update to the Prince George County, Maryland codes. That Prince George is a county between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore of about 1 million people. We are currently working with Fairfax County, Virginia, and Northern Virginia, and updating their code. We just completed and had adopted about a year ago now the Henrico County, Virginia code. That is the county in the Richmond metropolitan area. We've done a lot more county codes. We also work for cities, but we've done a lot of this type of work over the last 28, 29 years. As I said, next slide, as I said, we are delighted to have on our team 2 other firms. One is the collaborative firm here in the Atlanta metro area. They're going to work with us on zoning districts and facilitation. And I'll have Michael Hightower, their president's here. Michael, I'll let you sit.
Thanks, Greg. And also good to see some familiar faces from the other day. Bet you're back again and others. Michael Hightower with the collaborative firm. I'm also joined by Angela Rambo. Angela has been a zoning administrator in many major jurisdictions. She is post work for the city of Milton and the city of Riverdale in that capacity and other places. I'm glad to have her. She will be assisting on some of the technical support with Craig and the team. Also, we have in the back, we have Trish Corpesso and our public engagement team. Trish, raise your hand. Trish has worked throughout the region as well on communication, and she's also joined by Michelle Wilson, who also is a Cobb County resident. Our firm is 21 years old now, about 26 employees, and about 4 of our employees live in Cobb County. So we are happy that we have people who live in Cobb County and who understand what the county does. We have worked, we are not as old as Craig's firm, but we have worked on about 5 or 6 places throughout the Atlanta region. Clayton and Stonebridge and DeKalb and other places, Stockbridge, City of East Point. And we're also working on some other work with the Atlanta Beltlines Code process. So we're very happy to be a part of the team. And of course, I met Craig several years ago, and he and Jeff, as we had an office in Durham, North Carolina for about 3 years. And in that role, we got a chance to visit his office and looking at some opportunities in that region as well. So we'll be involved in text writing preparation, some of the text amendments that Angela will lead, as well as the work that Trish and Michelle will lead on the public engagement and communication side as we go along this track. So thanks for coming, and Craig, thank you.
Great, thanks, Michael. And also mentioned, we do have one other team member, a firm that has actually worked with us in 3 or 4 of our code updates in larger communities like Prince George County and Charlotte, and that is Stantec. They will focus on several areas: transportation, in other words, mobility standards, parking standards, landscaping standards, and stormwater management. So they are also a team member, which we've worked with before, and we are delighted to have them on board. Let me also say, and I forgot to do this when I introduced our firm, we have a number of professionals that will be working on the project, but with me, and will be participating in our presentation tonight is Jeff Green and David Henning. So in terms of the work program, Jessica mentioned it's an 18 to 20 month process. I think I mentioned that, and I think both of us mentioned that there are going to be multiple opportunities for input as we move through this process. One of the things we have learned in our work in updating development codes is it's very important to have the community involved as we go through this process, so that you have an opportunity to become familiar with what we're doing, to gain confidence in what we are doing, and understand that we're doing what has been directed of us to do. And how is that going to be done? We have 5 tasks. We are in the first task, and that first task really involves a couple of things. The consultants getting familiar with your current, regulations, the general development conditions and practices in the county. And also meeting with the community, and I use that term very broadly, to gain input and to educate you about, number one, the process itself, what our objectives are, or what the objectives should be, what you believe the objectives should be in the process. And then based upon that input is to begin synthesizing the information we hear, because there are clearly different opinions throughout the county. And we are trying to, in terms of the meetings, we're trying to cast the net as broadly as we can. After that, we will go to task 2. And task 2 is an interim step between hearing the community and distilling policy direction and planning documents and what we hear from you into an identified set of goals for the project before we start actually drafting the UDC document. What we do with this code assessment, and it will be a document that's 50 to 70 pages, not written in code language, but in layperson's language, where we identify what we have heard, synthesize what we've heard about what the goals for the project should be, and then based upon those identified goals, make suggestions or recommendations as to how in the updated, the revised new UDC, that those goals, we believe those goals can be achieved. That will be a document that we publish online. You will be able to receive it, to review it. And after the review, we will have meetings on it. And here we will make a presentation about the highlights of what is in the document, but we're really there to gain input from you. Hear from you, yes, we agree that these goals you've identified are the most important goals that should be achieved in the update, or no, that some of them are not, or that some of the recommendations are good, or we disagree, you should handle this in a different way. And we'll meet with the focus groups and the public and the elected officials on this and ultimately get directions from the elected officials about direction that it really needs to be followed, the goals that need to be achieved in the update process. As part of that assessment too, there is what we call an annotated outline. And that will be about a more detailed outline, about 20 pages, 25 pages of what the chapter by chapter basis of how the UDC would be structured. What will be the chapters and then what will be the sections in the chapters. And there'll be discussion on each of those chapters of that outline. So that's step 2. And then is only when we go through that process do we start the drafting. Step 2, the assessment, we'll be back and conduct these meetings in late April or May of next year, in about 4 to 5 months. And then after we get input, we'll start the drafting of the code. The code drafting will take about 12 to 14 months. We have also learned that we're not going to go back and draft the entire code document. We are going to draft it in installments. We're going to bite off parts of it in a logical way. Typically, we have found that the best way to organize that is to draft the zoning districts and the uses regulations first, or as a section, then the procedures, all the development review procedures, variances, rezonings, and other procedures together as one installment, and then finally the development standards as one installment. Once we draft each of these individual installments, we will conduct meetings again on each installment. So there'll be 3 sets of meetings, 3 opportunities. We will provide you availability to each of these draft materials before the meetings, and then we'll meet with you on the meetings, at the meetings, and discuss these drafts, get your input. Based upon the comments we receive, obviously we'll be making revisions to the drafts. But as we go through this process, after we have completed all 3 installments, you will have reviewed the draft materials. We will receive comments, and we will have the opportunity to make revisions to those comments. We then go to the 4th step, or the 4th stage, and that is we will test the new UDC. What I mean test is what we do is we will identify different property sites in the county that have the potential to where different types of development is allowed, whether it be commercial or residential or something in an activity center. And we will test what could be developed under the old regulations versus what could be developed under the new regulations. And we do that to make sure that we're achieving what the community wants us to achieve with these new regulations. And we will make revisions based upon that information. That information will be released. We'll have a public meeting on that. And then based on the comments we receive, we will make revisions. And then, and only then, will there be a draft of the UDC that will be available for public hearing process. Our experience has been if we conduct all of these meetings as we go through the drafting process, by the time we get to that public hearing draft, then we will have worked through a lot of the comments and issues that the community has about the code document. And the code will be ready for public review and adoption. So that's the process. Again, 18 to 20 months, and that's where we're going. Other thing I'll mention, I have mentioned about the website, and for those of you who have not accessed the website, we encourage you to do so. There is now a lot of information on the website, and there will be as we go through the process. There is a place where you can sign up and you will receive information about project updates, upcoming meetings. You'll be notified via email when we're going to be conducting a public meeting. There's a section on frequently asked questions. We actually have set up or placed on the website a survey questionnaire, which we encourage you to review and answer if you are so inclined. We heard this evening that there is one question too there's an error, and we're going to try to get that resolved this evening.
It's fixed.
It's fixed. Okay. It's fixed now, so that I believe is taken care of. So we encourage you to take the survey. Basically, the survey has some general questions about your experience with the current development regulations and just ask you about your thoughts and what you think is important in terms of getting addressed in the new regulations. So that's the website. We encourage you to use it as we go through this process. We think it will be very helpful. With respect to some of these project goals that we have heard about in the meetings that we have conducted up to date, Jeff and I would like to cover a few of those. I think that I am confident that I can say that there is a general consensus from all the groups that we have met with and heard, that this idea of making the current regulations more user-friendly in a lot of different ways is something that definitely needs to be addressed. When I say that, the kinds of things that need to be addressed go from resolving conflicting language in the current regulations. For example, right now in the current regulations, there's a use table in one section, but that tells you what uses are allowed in each of the zoning districts. But then there's a section on the zoning districts in another part of the code, and in that section, it also identifies uses that are allowed. And so you have two places, and the problem is that some of the uses conflict. Some are allowed in one of the sections, but not allowed in the other section. Another problem is that the definitions of the same uses from the table to the districts in some instances are different. So there's just a lot of confusion that's created and inconsistencies. So, and that's just one of the examples of inconsistencies. There are a lot of others. There are development standards. There's a development standards in another document, and there are some inconsistencies between those provisions and provisions in the zoning ordinance. There are development standards that are strewn throughout the document and including even in the definitions of the document. So it makes it difficult for anyone to completely understand what is being required when they can't go to one section and know what all the requirements are. They have to look in definitions. You have to look in the development standards, and in some instances, maybe even one or two other sections of the code. So just addressing internal conflicts and inconsistencies. There are a lot of terms that aren't defined. Another thing that we suggest in looking at the regulations is that the UDC could be more logically organized generally. The development regulations for any community are large documents. You have a zoning ordinance and a subdivision regulations, and you have development standards, and you have other documents that are referred to. So there's a lot of different documents. But one thing that we have learned is that, if you get down to the fundamental elements of a development code, there are basically three components or organizing principles. One principle or one organizing principle are the development review procedures. In other words, what kind of permits you have to receive before you can do a development. whether it's a rezoning or a variance or something else. A second is, and really is the heart of the zoning work, of the development regulations, are the zoning districts and the uses. They tell you, what kind of use you can put in the geographic area where you live. And they have basic rules governing lot area and setbacks, height, and things of that nature. And that's a unifying concept. That's something that's also should be well integrated. And the third part of a development code are the developments. I use the term development standards, but what I'm talking about are the parking requirements and the landscaping requirements. What is now in your development standards document, design standards and things of that nature, signage. So anyway, what I would suggest is that it would be a great idea to organize the UDC using those three unifying concepts and to, for example, consolidate your procedures in one chapter. So that's another thing that could be done. Jeff, if you could go to the next slide. Another thing that could be done to make the development regulations much more user-friendly is to take advantage of the advances in software technology that have occurred over the last decade. It's pretty amazing. I've been doing this for 30 years. And it's amazing what you can do today, which is zoning ordinance, with what you could do when I started working in this field in terms of just the use of graphics and photographs and that sort of thing. Your codes are very old and they haven't taken advantage of these types of tools. We suggest, let's do that. And just, I'm going to pass this around just to give you an idea of what could be done. We did a development code for the city of Maitland, Florida. It is an inner-ring suburb community. It's a city of Orlando. It was adopted last summer, or this last summer. But it shows basically how you can integrate. This is a zoning district. If you look at the zoning districts that you currently have in your code, it's all text. It's, strung over multiple pages. What this has, there isn't a lot of text here. There's tables and there's graphics of it. It starts with a purpose statement saying this is what the character of the district should be. We have photographs of what that character looks like. There's a dimensional standards table. I'm going to pause. And over here, we've done a three-dimensional drawing, which shows the application of the dimensional standards. So it's two pages. Now, there are some of the districts that are a little more complex, and we'll add standards, but basically, this is the format for all of the districts. This document is just the zoning districts in Maitland. I'll pass this around for you to take a look at, but that's the kind of thing that we could do, and it's not only, we can do that with the zoning districts, but there's a lot of graphics that we can put into development standards. Well, it's showing graphically, what the landscaping requirements should be, or how, what the buffers should look like. In terms of the opacity and the types of planning that should be done, or the type of planning that should be done in parking lots. This is another code. This is from, I mentioned Pike and Rico County, Virginia, in the Richmond metro area. This is basically zoning. Yeah. So, these are just some of the things that we can do to make the code much more user friendly. The other thing that I will highlight, and I'm going to turn this over to Jeff, is your recently updated comprehensive plan, which identifies 5 or 6 what we consider to be very important goals. One is protecting the character of existing suburban neighborhoods. Let me emphasize, and Jeff will, or let me just state, Jeff will actually emphasize this more when he's going to talk about zoning districts, is that we have heard from loud and clear from the focus groups as well as the meeting we had last night and the other meetings that we have had is that the current residential zoning districts are working well. They need to remain as they are. And certainly we understand that, and that certainly will be something that will be carried forward in the updated UDC. But protecting the character, the other thing is to build on the current other standards in the code that are used to protect the character of the suburban and rural neighborhoods. Encouraging redevelopment and infill development in the activity centers is something else that's identified. Conserving natural and historic resources, generally supporting economic development where that is appropriate to do, and providing an opportunity for a variety of housing types. So those are objectives or goals that have been identified in your 2040 comprehensive plan. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and Jeff's going to highlight a few more things.
Thanks, Greg. So one of the goals Greg talked about earlier on was making the document a little better organized, a little more user-friendly. One way to do so would be to consolidate all of the procedures in one chapter. You can really get a lot of efficiencies and make it easier to understand if you set up a set of standard procedures that apply generally. So, for example, for every application, you need to submit it. So there's no real reason that you need to have separate application submission provisions. You can just go ahead and have a general, one single application submission procedure process and apply that to all of the different procedures. Now, obviously, if you're applying for a rezoning, you're going to have different requirements than if you're trying to get a permit of some sort. So there will be sort of variations for every type of development application, but it's a concept and it's a method of organization that makes it a lot easier to understand how a development application sort of goes through the process, through the planning commission, to the county commissioners, to the Board of Zoning Appeals, if they're the body that hears it. We will also go ahead and clarify the review standards and procedures that apply. One thing we learned is that it's not clear in some cases how the different review bodies are making their decisions and what standards apply. So we will go ahead and go through and make sure those are clear, and so it's obvious to everybody how the decision needs to be made. Another part is to modify the zone districts. Greg said, I will emphasize, we have no plan to change the uses that are allowed in the R80 district, the R40 district, the R30 district, all of the other single-family districts. Currently in those districts, you're allowed to have a single-family dwelling, a single-family detached dwelling. There's a variety of other similar uses, golf courses, things like that. No commercial, no retail. We intend to carry that forward. So a lot of what we're talking about here with the zone districts are sort of reorganizing the way Craig talked about to make it a little easier to understand. Outside of the residential districts, we're going to take a close look at all of your districts. We'll look to see to make sure that they, support the type of development that's called for in your comprehensive plan. You all have a lot of land in the county that's identified as a regional activity center or a neighborhood activity center, as well as some high density and medium density residential areas. So we want to make sure that the zoning districts that are in the new UDC will support all of the different types of development that are called for in the comprehensive plan. And finally, I just want to point out the use table down there. Craig talked about how the different zoning districts have different lists of uses. One thing that I noticed while reviewing the code is that you have a use called community fair, which is a publicly run fair like the North Georgia State Fair. It's currently the same definition is in there at least 24 different times because it's included in each zoning district. And the problem is if you decide to change the definition or change anything about it, you have to change it in all 24 different places. As well, it makes the code longer and harder to read. So what we're going to propose to do is to have a principal use table. All of the uses will be listed there. Each use will be clearly defined, so we'll make sure there are precise definitions for each use. So it's clear what a use is and how one use differs from another use. And we'll also go ahead and you'll be able to tell what zoning district each use is allowed in, and whether it's something that's allowed by right, or if it requires a special land use permit or some other sort of special approval. We'll also add new uses that might not be in your current code. Some of the other potential project goals, Craig talked a little bit about development standards. So these are the standards that apply generally. They may vary by zoning district or they may vary by where you're located, but these are sort of the things that apply generally. Parking mobility standards, we learned that there are some places where the parking requirements may be a little bit high, especially in some of those areas that are targeted for infill and redevelopment. They may actually be hampering the ability for some of that redevelopment to move forward because of the high parking requirement. So we're going to, get away from one size fits all. We're going to take a close look at each of the uses that are going to be included in the new code. We're going to, look at best practices, look at your current code, look at some of your recent experiences, and see, try to recalibrate those so that you're providing the right amount. You're requiring developers to provide the right amount of parking. And we'll also provide opportunities to reduce parking in appropriate circumstances. So, for example, if you have a mixed-use development with different uses that are busy at different times of day, you can use some of the parking for multiple uses. So you don't need to provide one parking spot for the movie theater and one parking spot for the office. They can share a spot because they're going to be occupied at different times of the day. The other thing that we heard, and I think Craig mentioned earlier, is that there was talk about the design of parking lots and improving some of the landscaping and the look and feel of those. Right? Landscaping and tree protection. One, you can see in the top right, we have a little graphic there that's a sample from another code of a standard set of transitional buffers. So these are the buffers that you establish between incompatible uses. So between a residential use and a commercial use, or between an industrial use and a commercial use. Having these sets of standard transitional buffers can, especially when they're sort of graphically demonstrated like this, can make the code easier to use and can also improve quality of development outcomes. Because developers will know what kind of buffer that they're required to provide. They'll be tailored to different contexts. And another thing that we heard is that there's concern about clear cutting of trees and preservation of important trees. So we'll sort of look into that, and we'll also consider integrating the tree ordinance into the UDC, because a lot of it has to do with development. Exterior lighting, we'll look into new exterior lighting standards. They're pretty simple, but they can make a pretty big impact on quality of life at nighttime, and especially help preserve the night sky. Stormwater, we heard, especially from staff, that the current regulations might get in the way of some of the green infrastructure alternatives that you might use these days that have been developed over the last couple decades. So we'll look into that. That's something that Stantec will really be helping us out with, as they're experts in this field. Neighborhood compatibility. We've heard that generally the county does a pretty good job making sure that when there's new commercial development near an existing residential neighborhood, it's designed in such a way that it mitigates the impacts of noise, the impacts of light, things like that. So one thing that we're going to go and do is make sure that in the new UDC, we have a good set of neighborhood compatibility standards to make sure that you continue, that these new developments continue to have limited, minimal impact on existing neighborhoods. And finally, signs. Your sign regulations, they were updated not too long ago. They're very text heavy. And that's a particular case where we think having some graphics and illustrations will help make clear the intent and the purpose of the regulations. All right, if you go to the next slide. So we're going to ask you to rate some of the potential project goals that Craig and I talked about earlier. If you're having any issues, please let us know. And if online, if you have any issues, please put that in the chat.
Out of curiosity, if we're retired, do you want us to just answer it in Cobb County or instead of?
Probably just live in Cobb County. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's all right. This is not scientific. This is not going to. We're just sort of curious about this here. Yeah. All right. Thank you, David. Okay. So now we're going to start with the polling and project goals. We're going to start with 5 of the COB 2040 priorities that we identified as being relevant to this project. And so we'll just go ahead one by one. So first is encouraging redevelopment and infill development in identified activity centers. So Jessica actually gave us a 110-mile tour of Cobb County this morning. So we spent 4 hours visiting, and we looked at the town center as well as the Cumberland regional activity centers. So we know there's, especially at town center, there's a lot of potential for refill development, redevelopment, and there's also opportunities for infill development in the county. So we're going to go ahead and hide the answers at the beginning just to give folks a chance to respond, and then we'll show the results.
Keyword here is identify.
Yes,
Already
exactly.
existing on the land use plan.
Existing on the future land use map.
May you please describe infill development? What is that?
Yes, so infill development is, redevelopment is, when you take an existing site and sort of redevelop it generally into something more intensive. Infill development is when you take an empty lot or an empty area and add development that is compatible with what you have on either side.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so that's majority find it important or very important. All right. Protecting the character of existing suburban and rural neighborhoods. As Craig mentioned earlier, that is something that folks at the focus groups, as well as yesterday's meeting, felt very important. All right. Thank you all. Conserving natural and historic resources. One thing that was pointed out last night was that natural resources and historic resources were very different. We recognize that. We want to be consistent with the questions though. Want to get your view as to, how important it is that the UDC include provisions that protect historic or natural resources. Or both. All right. It looks like most folks think that's a pretty important priority. Supporting economic development. Cobb obviously is it's a growing county in a region that is continuing to grow pretty quickly. And the arrival of the world champion Atlanta Braves has obviously had an impact as well. So just want to see how important of a priority that should be to support economic development through land use development. A little more of a mix here, but more than half think that this is a pretty important topic. Finally, providing a variety of housing opportunities. And I just want to reiterate again, your R80, your R40, we're not intending to make any changes. Currently in the county, you have, your wonderful single family neighborhoods. You have many of those. There's some townhouses that have developed as well. You also have the large apartment buildings. Many of them are in the city, some of them in the activity centers. What we're thinking about here with a variety of housing opportunities are sort of housing opportunities in the middle of these. So not necessarily perhaps smaller townhouses, perhaps cottage homes. Those are cottage homes. They are cottage homes, if you don't know, are homes about 800 to 1,200 square feet in size, generally organized around a common green. So they don't have their own lawn. They have sort of a shared common area in lieu of a lawn. They're a little more dense than your single family homes and a lot less dense than your multifamily. But this is sort of a type of housing that can be accommodated. So there's a real mixed views here. All right. Next, we're going to talk about the project goals relating to having an easier to use code. If you go on to the next one. So using graphics, photos, and flowcharts to communicate zoning concepts. That's something we've identified. looking at your current code where there aren't a lot of illustrations, we think there's some opportunity to improve the user friendliness by including these new UDC. Looks like most folks think that's an important priority. A more logical organization, a little more easier to figure out where applicable provisions are. All right, that's great. You all are very quick with the responses. And more streamlined and logical development review procedures. Now, mind you, this doesn't mean making it easier for projects to get through. This just talked about how the procedures are explained in the document and how clear they are, and to make sure there are not any unnecessary steps or confusing processes in the procedures. Right? Okay, a few questions about development standards. Want to learn about your priorities, see how important these are for you. The first are improving the off-street parking and mobility standards. So that gets at both the number of parking spaces the development is required to provide, as well as the design of the parking spaces, requiring larger tree islands to provide some additional shade, providing paved walkways like we showed here through parking lots to make it safer and easier to get from your parking space to the store or building that you're trying to access. There's a real mix there. Improving the landscaping and tree protection standards. The landscaping, it can apply to buffers between properties. It can apply to vegetation that's along the street. And it can also apply to vegetation that's within development and within parking. Most people think that's at least moderately important. Everybody thinks it's at least moderately. New exterior landscape.
Just a comment.
Yeah.
Simply commercial lighting where we get the blue off these new electronic signs on the street. It's just not made.
Oh, so this is, it wouldn't be signs. Are you talking about like the digital signs that?
Yeah, some of them are so hot, you come down there and you see traffic.
Yeah, that's a good thing to note, and we'll note that. If you can write that in the survey, but what we're asking about here is just, lights, not signs, but street lights and also lights within parking lots and lights on site as well. It's mixed. A lot of people think it's important, but not maybe the top priority. Finally, the last question is about improved neighborhood compatibility standards. We want to know how important a priority it is to have standards that mitigate any impacts that any development coming near existing single-family residential neighborhoods may have on these neighborhoods.
Is this what you mean, what we call it? Compatibility standards, is that what we call allowed uses?
Mostly about it's not as much about the uses that are allowed, because that should hopefully be taken care of by zoning and by, what zoning district is assigned to that area. It's more about if there is a permitted use that's going to go into that site, whether it's a small store or a restaurant, to make sure it's designed in such a way that any impacts that it's going to have on neighboring property are directed away from where the single family residence.
So like backyard chickens.
No, it's
That's
more
that's famous.
We're talking about uses that are adjacent to the homes in a district, not in the same district.
yeah.
Okay, now that would include density, right?
It It can include density. I mean, generally these get at sort of the massing
I
for,
think that's too clear, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay,
we understand that.
okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yes.
I've been to a lot of meetings where I was like, what role is Marietta? The Marietta Housing Authority does anything to do with our zoning regulations and development regulations. Who's coming? If they are doing a project in Howard, recently, within the last couple of years, if they're doing a project in unincorporated Howard, one of the things we want to be sure is spelled out clearly in our code is that they will still be subject to our zoning regulations. Right? So, and that's about the insurance. That's one thing we want to be sure is spelled out very clearly. How would you? Just the language, the legal language in the code that would make that happen. There's some ambiguous language right now in code that speaks to what extent authorities such as advising employees, hospital authority, or some of those other entities would be subject to our code. So that's something that has come up with Marietta County Authority. We want to ensure that it's clear that it's a very common authority for development in Cobb County that it needs to by standards. So that they will be essential for that.
I talked to our Commissioner Kelly about that issue on County Road. That was not exactly the best work, but that this change is actually making the language better from it from 6 inch total. We got to get 13. That's what the change is doing.
It's
There are now.
It's a big issue because Marietta Housing Authority seems to have a lot of jurisdiction on a whole lot of things that they don't go along with the code of Cobb County, and Cobb County doesn't seem to have jurisdiction over it. So this is my laywoman's. I'm very familiar with it. We recognize it as something we've already worked through as an organization because very important. That's right. Although they're Marietta Housing Authority, they are the entity in Cobb that holds all of the housing. So the other issue I had was it looks very interesting. It's like this is not pretty safe. And I want to know what's and something most of those out there is that do address the issues dealing with age, housing and stuff like that. So what in particular do you think that we need to include in these plans about more age friendly, like more sidewalks, more sidewalks?
That's a great segue to the next question about what goals that you think need to be addressed in the update. So somebody has said you help projects that are going to have more limited for seniors. So now, I'm sorry, not the library, maybe else. I think this is a great opportunity and a good segue to the next question here about what are the other goals that you think need to be addressed in the update. So there's livability for seniors in Cobb, something that we want to be sure is included, and if so, what are some of the things that you think might make Cobb County more livable for seniors?
It's just not for seniors, it's supposed to be transportation, sidewalks, mobility, road that we already have years on. Right. I don't know what you talked about, like, those are some of the issues. But, you know, just having the availability of services for seniors. Of course, we have the centers, but that's not how seniors, unfortunately, it was. But I am concerned, and I'm using myself as an example, that when I go out to my walk, I can't find a pavement around a little subdivision, and the next half a block on the road, there's no safety there. That's a major issue. Looking around this road, and most of us need certain things as we age, we're aging. staying around a little longer. We'll all be there. We'll all be there. So, that is a real issue.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I have two questions. One is, we all know the county's growing. But getting to 200,000 people in the next 20, 30 years, whatever the study showed. How do we know that that growth will be accommodated? You know, will we look to see like where those people are going to move to and that where those people live? And the rest of each other different areas of the county based on that expected growth of, 200,000. It's like, like that's what we're planning for today, we also are planning, future things about just knowing, like basically solving that puzzle of where is everyone going to fit in. I think it's a challenge. It's a challenge at various.
Well, to some degree, in terms of where they're going to go, they will make their own choices. But right now, you have a future land. You have two things I think that place some limitations or restrictions on where they go. One is your land use plan and your future land use maps, which I would suggest that you look at that. It has identified areas, for example, I think, where there's going to be low density residential growth or rural character, and there'll be limits in terms of where people can go in those areas. There are activity centers, 2 regional activity centers where there are higher densities as well as areas that are designated to higher density residential development. Obviously, there'll be more of the ability to accommodate more people in those areas. The zoning districts are also, is also going to dictate that same issue.
So we look at that land map and know that, X number of people per acre in those different land use types, and we know, hey, there's 50 acres for those type of land uses. I think we can start seeing like, can we fit 200,000, or, because that is just one of those things where I don't, is it possible for land use to change the happen?
We have not done specifically, our firm has not done that type of calculation. I'm not sure if it exists, by initial reaction and looking at the map, though it is yet probably even one.
And I'll just add to that, of course, it's what a number of you know, we've recently updated the 2040 comprehensive plan. And so I think an important thing to keep in mind is that the comprehensive plan is a policy document that includes the future land use map and kind of determines based on community input where different types of land uses, density and intensity goes throughout the county. From there, the codes, the development standards are ultimately a tool to plan implementation. So what we're doing here is, and as they've outlined, here are some of the policy goals that were identified in the comprehensive plan. How do we shape our codes? Are there changes that are needed? Is it working just fine? How do we make sure that those codes, those regulations are going to help us achieve the land use plan that Cobb County has set it wants? So it's 2 separate tools. And the next update to the future land use map, or the next update to the comprehensive plan, will be a full update, whereas this one was just a 5-year update, and that'll be in 5 years. So, and then we'll take a fresh look at how much has the population grown, how's the projection changed, and always an interesting activity.
And just it's like, so like, I would love to see more of that this year. Or style, things like that for options. Boy, that right now, I just think the county's lacking a lot of there. Not everyone, I personally don't want to have 4,000 square foot, 1.5 acre lot. I want, I want just a small area where I can walk. And it's limited.
Well, I mean, we will make note of your comment about that. Those types of uses could go in that regional activity center that I mentioned, as well as the higher density residential areas of the plan. But ultimately, the elected officials are going to have to make some decisions about, that kind of development. Yes, sir.
Maybe related to that, I just want to also ensure that there's inclusionary
housing and accommodation. Cobb has often been somewhat exclusionary, and providing more for upper economic. And I think this has characterized a lot of the recent housing developments that leave out the affordable housing and those that workforce in our area, even AD or whatever. This has to be, of course, adjusted for the compatibility too, but this, so that there is, I know as you mentioned somewhere that diverse housing, the goals, and so, I would affirm that need. And I speak as a resident of 40 years, it came to an area that was almost exclusive, East Cobb, white, whatever, but as over the years has diversified, and I find it very healthy, and our community has not suffered. In fact, it's benefited from the diversity.
Okay. Well, that's good.
He said, you've been involved with many individuals who are homeless and stuff like that. It came to us. And I think that's something we're all over. This is not just here in Cobb County, it's all over the country. But we feel in Cobb County, there's some provisions for homeless or finding they're just out of the street and stuff. We're not, Cobb County's not public, as far as I know. And we talked about this, bottles of getting 100% service room, we were going to do units there. This was like 2 or 3 years ago. And at the same time, how we want to live, in the community that everybody's proud of, that all the people don't have to sleep. And we're concerned about that. We can build all these units along Fox Creek Road. And still, we have a whole school of people who are homeless and getting more so every day. We want to address that and have the term affordable is relative. And so, how everybody that we live, we have to walk over people, what kind of provisions we talk about?
I'd like, may I respond to? I think also there is being a survey of housing. There needs to be a housing summit also to assess where we are in this and to break through the inaccessibility of some of the housing for an average worker.
Okay. Yes, sir, you have.
Yeah, I've been involved in fighting, not all development, but just development that's been particularly egregious. This development's been proposed to sometimes be put into the neighborhoods and sometimes put next to the neighborhoods. And those are the two things that our neighborhoods we want to protect. Put a 400-unit complex that's got to go through it. The only outlet to the neighborhood is going to, in fact, the quality of lives to the neighborhoods. It is. And so we want to make sure that what goes in the neighborhoods and is exclusionary, because we want our neighborhoods to be protected. I don't want to see the protections that we have now for our neighborhoods relaxed so that our neighborhoods are impacted negatively. We've made investments in our properties, investments that we should have protected, and that's what the zoning codes do now, and they should be. The second thing is procedures. The zoning attorneys here, they like to put little things like, we reserve the right to change anything and everything about this application up to throughout anywhere in the process and all. And, that has included handing out new site plans in the middle of a hearing. So there's no public input. As new stipulations in the middle of a hearing. there needs to be the public, there's two different sets of interests being balanced. The applicant has interest, so does the community. And we need a process so that we in the community have a fair shot at having time to review and understand and not have things just sprung on us. And that is going on. It feels like sometimes that because developers are able to, the applicants are able to submit things that are incomplete and they get away with it. And they should not be able to submit things that are incomplete so that we in the community don't know what is going in. We have a right to know as well. And that's what the county should be doing, is protecting our rights in the community. Not just the applicant's rights to have a thing, but our rights in the community. And that is something that seems to me that's been lost, is that our rights in the community should be protected in the process just as much as the applicant's rights.
Well, thank you for your comments. I do want to reiterate that we are not going to be changing any of the standards or removing any of the restrictions affecting the neighborhoods in the update.
I've heard that, but I've also heard that things are going to be put next to our neighborhoods that we're not going to have a say in. We want, and you're talking about what goes inside the neighborhoods, but that still leaves room to make adjustments to what goes next to the neighborhoods.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that the zoning ordinance is not going to be able to do, though, is the zoning ordinance and the zoning map can protect you from that happening. But if the elected officials are going to make a rezoning, approve a rezoning on something, as long as they have the votes, they're going to be able to do it.
I'm very familiar with the
Yes,
process.
I'm sure you are. But, and the one thing that those neighborhood compatibility standards will do unless they're abolished, is that, you know, if you have a 300-foot or 400-foot requirement, that, you know, these objectionable uses can't go within 400 feet of a piece of residential property, that zoning is not going to help them too much, at least within that 400 feet. So, I mean, there are some restrictions that can be put in those standards that would help you even if something like that happens. But I understand what you're saying. The other thing, let me just say is, you know, I think what you're asking, and we certainly have included this in other development codes, it's certainly not unusual, and that is a set of public hearing, what I call public hearing procedures, which sets down the rules, you know, that are going to govern a public process, so that if someone cannot submit materials that changes the site plan in the middle of hearing without being delayed and giving an opportunity for that to be reviewed. I mean, that's pretty common in those procedures, something like that, or if there are other protections, you know, for the public, for the community.
Attention, teachers, the library will close.
We hear you on that issue.
Yeah, that's the part of the UDC that I
Thank you.
frankly have looking forward to.
Yes, sir.
I'd just like to follow up to the point I'm starting with this. First of all, we are hearing some things tonight and last night, and I would like to acknowledge that you all are stating very clearly and unambiguously for the first time over the last year and a half that this process is going to protect the character of suburban neighborhoods. That's the first time Cobb County has been willing to say that. I want to acknowledge that you have very clearly and unambiguously said that. I applaud that. I'd like to point out to his point that East Cobb has sustained the character of its suburban areas, while at the same time, it has clearly significantly diversified as far as who is there. We're all in support of that.
At the same time, to this person's point, it is very, very, very important, and clearly, you've already heard this from many people in Cobb County, that we want to preserve the character of our suburban, single-family neighborhoods. You've acknowledged that, and I think, the other thing I wanted to ask you about is I've looked at both these zoning ordinances, and in both examples, it looks like the use restrictions are someplace else. You know, we are used to in our zoning code that we look at R30, and you can see that the zoning, what the use restrictions are right there. That doesn't mean that we can't make an adjustment. I just want to be sure that, as I'm looking through this, that we're not losing those use restrictions, that they're going to remain the same and sustain the character of our suburban neighborhoods.
Yeah, I mean, the uses are gonna stay the same. What we have found to be the most efficient, one of the problems you have in your current regulations, I understand that those uses are in the districts, but you also have a use table, and that use table, there are conflicts.
Use restrictions in every single R district, and I get that.
Yeah, and so what we have found is it's much more efficient to have that use, just one table, one use table. It's gonna have the residential districts in it, and it's gonna have the residential, the uses that you have in there. So,
And just one more quick point. I fully expect, and I think state law and the Atlanta Regional Commission will require this anyway. Cobb County is going to have to provide a full range of housing types, and we're going to have numerous opportunities throughout the county for a wide variety, a full variety of housing types. No problem with that. But that doesn't mean that every housing type has to go in every neighborhood. So there are appropriate places for various housing types throughout the community. And I represent a neighborhood where this is unusual. We are adjacent to an industrial area. We like the industrial area. We want to keep the industrial area. So some neighborhoods might be opposed to industrial. We're not. So you mentioned residential, commercial, activity center. Industrial is an important type of development also. It clearly needs to be included in all this. And guidance for one is not opposed to, we want to keep the industrial area that we are adjacent to.
we heard your comment, we made a note of that. I would I'll just tell you, we made copies of those districts just to show you how graphically we can do it. But I can tell you that in both of those communities, that there are multiple residential districts that only allow single family uses. So, I mean, it's not like it's different in a lot of other places. So, okay.
I just have one quick comment on. I still think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what this is all about. I actually am a supporter, okay, so I've been trying to do my part to help out with that if I can, see it on social media or something, but even tonight though, I think we saw examples of maybe misunderstanding what this is. This is a very narrowly focused topic we're on, talking about a UDC, but it's not a comp plan. Now, there's overlap, of course, and UDC comes out of the comp plan, of course. But there had people brought up other topics, housing. I think they actually have their own strategic plan, and the county's doing its own strategic plan also. I wasn't able to make a meeting, but that's where some things like homelessness and that sort of thing can be addressed. I mean, something like that's not going to be addressed in the UDC. This is more about zoning, and then the overlap of zoning, and then the more technical aspects of what go into site development. So So I mean, if there's a way we could, help educate the public about that, there might be, it might be helpful, because what I keep seeing is people are worried about this, and I'm going, there's really nothing to worry about. This is good. I mean, I like the UDC if I go somewhere to work. I do work all over the country. I don't do much around here, actually. I don't really know that much about what they're going to leave or not, but when I go somewhere and they got a UDC, I'm thinking, oh, that's great. I don't have to go looking for the development standards manual necessarily. Or if I need, if I need to show someone a graphic, one of my site planners, something like that, look, this is what they want. So, I just hope we can set that straight, because if we start going off on these rabbit trails, we're just kind of gonna waste a lot of time.
Yeah, well, we try to educate at these meetings. We also have frequently asked question answers on the website. We need to do follow-up meetings on that issue on the educational purposes.
You speak just a little louder.
I'm sorry.
Some of us are very, my ball way.
Yes, ma'am. This lady's got her hand up.
I just wanted to echo what we said about the streamlining that they have one document that, I'm not a developer, this is not my area of expertise, but I would hope that with the creation of the UDC, what we could encourage more of in Cobb County is more local, small-scale developers who are more in tune with what our neighborhoods want and the character of our neighborhoods, who can engage in the process more easily with less expense and with less trouble up front to be able to contribute to our community in that way. So my hope would be with the UBC that we could see more of that happening. I would also ask, I know we've heard mentioned a couple of times the regional activity centers. We have Town Center, we have Cumberland. But what I would like to draw attention to are our community activity centers that are scattered throughout the county, which in my view offer potentially an opportunity to consider some of the infill developments and some of the more flexible housing options. And potentially a gentle mix of uses that would allow, as the lady was saying, easier access to everyday needs for seniors, for example. I haven't heard much said about our smaller community activity centers, which are established commercial areas that tend to lie within existing neighborhoods, and what we can do to kind of perhaps nurture some of those places.
Okay, we will definitely take a look at that. Thank you. Let's, anybody else? Okay, yes, sir.
Okay, one final comment, to hopefully there will be some flexibility in what is devised to allow for change in some of the established neighborhoods and a certain evolution. For example, aging folks who one spouse passes away, they have large house or whatever to let out, rent, what do you call it, CDU, add on EDU, kind of, so that just the zoning restrictions don't prohibit us from using lots of available space and where the housing is so needed, and churches and other buildings that might offer a certain practical resolution, the lack of housing. Just flexibility, somehow we can build that in. I'm not a developer, so I don't know how you achieve that, but keep the flexibility open.
Okay, thank you.
And that sounds like, to me, destroying this exclusionary zoning we have, which I'm opposed to.
To this point, about the application, contentious and hearing, pushing the commission for an incomplete plan, or to be held over for another month. In this new EDC, would there be any rules, basic rules of a submission, such that what makes it a complete submission? like, whether it's an attorney presenting, or whether it's just a homeowner, a landowner.
I will tell you this, that I cannot think of a code that we have drafted and has been adopted as long as I can remember. It did not have.
30 years, we've never written any contentious,
Well,
let's say.
I mean, what I was gonna say was, we have provision in the code that basically says, we call it something like completeness determination. Someone can submit an application and it has to be reviewed for completeness. If it's not complete, it's gonna be sent back to the applicant. It's not gonna, the review process doesn't start until the complete application is submitted. And that is a very typical procedure or requirement. Now, you know, that has, there are, interestingly enough, I can't give you an exact number, but there have been a number of communities where we work that did not have that kind of provision in their code when we started the process, and they added it. And I do think it makes a big difference. I don't think it's going to solve 100% of your problems, but if you require complete applications, if you don't start processing the application until they're complete, then that will help a lot. You know, it really then becomes, you know, staff administration ensuring that there are applications.
But either of the examples you circulated tonight.
But we typically, procedure section also have a provision dealing with what I call submittals that occur that substantially change the application request. You know, where a different site plan is submitted, and basically those provisions require the application to go back to a review, not only by the public, by the staff. So that's pretty common.
Just give me an excellent example to the question of the process for your whole procedure. Today, if community comes in and raises heck in a zoning hearing, and the planning commissioner or the board of commissioner is presented some significant change to the number of houses and lots. Now, what you're hearing here is these people would like to have, if there's a change bigger than X, it's got to wait 30 days to come back to the next hearing. What they're saying is the change is made there during the hearing and they go ahead and vote. Okay, now that's a significant change of the law and in procedure besides what Cobb County currently has. Okay? I don't know, I was on the board for 12 years. I did it a long time. It's been 10 years since I did it, so they may have changed some things, but my understanding is that that's still there. But my point is the question of law. Will the adoption of this UDC create all of the pieces of law like that, or will we just put together what we got, organize and make it easier to use?
Well, we can change the legislation on the procedures if that's what the elected officials want us to do.
Would that come forward as a separate, in regular order, or would that come forward as a separate piece of business for the Board of Commissioners to make that change, or would it be buried in the midst of this 70-pound document?
Well, first of all, we would spell that out in the assessment, the document, you know, 50 to 70 page document. And we would say that, you know, this is something that needs to be addressed. And, you know, based upon that, we would get direction from ultimately direction from the commission and say, yeah, let's make that change. And then if that's the direction we got, then we would make that change in the ordinance.
So it all roll up in the one UDC thing. There could be a whole pocket of these new laws that you create after this review.
Yeah, I mean, but we're going to
So I'm going to give a list of significant law changes that are embedded.
Yeah, first of all, they'll be highlighted in the assessment, but then the other thing that what you'll see, if you see some of the code drafts that we have done before the adoption period, is they will have, you know, I mean, this might sound daunting, but some of them will have 700-800 footnotes because we footnote any change. If it's changed from the old to the new, then our goal is to footnote.
So we're going to have to do some pretty serious homework.
It will be, well, I think what we have found is having those footnotes makes it a lot easier, though, because when you review something, you'll know if it's a change or not a change. You know, if, you know, for example, when we with the residential zoning districts, there'll be a footnote that basically said there haven't been any changes in the standards and uses in the zoning districts. If there's a new zoning district, we'll say this is a new zoning district that wasn't in the old code. If there are some modest changes in adult zoning district, we'll put a footnote in and say, there are these changes. With respect to the procedures, we add a public hearing procedure, we add some other requirements, we will footnote it and say, these are changes.
And it's not necessarily about changing laws. I mean, it's just things like, one of the things the county doesn't do, in my opinion, is charge the developers for the impacts of laws. And require the documentation up front to show those impacts. You got a school zone and you're gonna dump a major amount of traffic out and you're gonna require a traffic study and you're not gonna see what's going on with traffic right there next to the school. I mean, you just common sense things that really should get kicked back and say, this shouldn't go forward without, this being looked at. And I don't know that that's a law change, it's kind of common sense thing.
Well, I would say that, typically in the development codes we've done, if there's a need for a traffic study, there'll be some rules that set down in the code that basically say, if you're generating X amount of external trips a day, or if you're in a certain area of the community or you're within a certain distance of the school or something like that, then you're going to have to do a study.
So the way they get around that is they mischaracterize what they're applying for, and they get a lower traffic trip generation numbers, and then after once it's approved, then it gets changed. So, I mean, that's the problem with those sorts of things, is they figure out ways around it. And that's why, we need to know what they're actually gonna build, not what they just put out. And,
Well, I mean, typically they're not supposed to build anything other than what's been approved in the bill. So, yes, sir.
Yes, into this particular discussion. First of all, I want to encourage you to listen to what Bob said, since he served on the planning commission for 12 years. And he dealt with hundreds, if not in the thousands of zoning cases. So he has the best expertise in the room. I've led the zoning negotiations for bindings for virtually every zoning case that's come up in the greater bindings area for the last 20 years. I've dealt with hundreds of zoning cases, and I have negotiated a lot of deals. Some of those deals, and let me acknowledge the points that have been made, that it is very important to have a complete application before it comes forward. And that includes any required traffic studies. I agree with that. At the same time, having dealt with hundreds of zoning cases myself, I can tell you that there are times that we can negotiate up to the night before the zoning, or even up to the morning before, minutes before the zoning, and reach a deal at the last second. In addition to that, there are times that we don't reach a deal. The developer presents their perspective, the community presents their perspective, the Board of Commissioners thinks there are legitimate points on both sides. And during the zoning hearing, in effect, the commissioners themselves negotiate the deal in the minute that the two sides wind up agreeing to during the zoning hearing. So while I do think it's important that the case be complete before it's allowed to move forward, I also think that when you're putting together whatever regulations you're putting together, there needs to be the flexibility for the commissioners to allow either a negotiated deal that's negotiated and literally the last minute, or for the commissioners themselves to have the flexibility to negotiate out the deal during the course of the zoning hearing itself.
Okay, we'll hear your comments. I mean, we've also heard comments that there need to be more measurable standards, review standards that development has to comply with. That everybody.
So do you normally, when you do an UDC process, do you start with zone categories before the procedure? Is that typical?
We'll make it, I'm not sure what, how we're gonna start. We'll work that out with the staff. I'd be interested if you have a recommendation or suggestion. Does it matter to you?
I would start with the actual, the procedurals, and the procedures in the process. I actually would.
Okay.
That's my opinion, but because to me, that's where the conflict is. And we do have a lot of conflict in this county, which I think a lot of it is unnecessary. We could, there's a better way to do this, as I think someone else has just been saying. Needs to be clear upfront what the expectations are. And what public input is, and even availability of information. And I'll share something with you later, Jessica, on that. I'll say it probably on public. Okay. So I got an example I could share. Even.
Any other comments? Number one, we really appreciate your input. I do want to be very clear. One of our primary goals is to make this process as transparent as possible. We're not trying to hide anything. We're gonna be back in front of you throughout this process. We encourage you to review the materials from the beginning, because your input will be important through this process. So thank you for coming out.
I think you've done a great job so far, so thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Five presentation survey.
So thank you. Is there an email address? Public comments and
I think the best way to, the survey is, it has like, the questionnaire is like 6 questions, and they're pretty open-ended. Okay. So that would be yeah, I mean, you can fill it out as many times as you want. And you can, if you have a comment that's not related to one of the, I mean, they're pretty broad questions, but it's not related, it will still get in there. And the other way to do it, a good way to do it is to email Jessica.
Okay, that's, yeah. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.
It's gonna be your project?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm James.
James, I'm good.
Nice to meet you. You're from Virginia now?
North Carolina. Yeah, Chapel Hill. Oh, really?
North Carolina. Early 2000s.